Salvage officer Dren Kovalis had seen a great many decommissioned fleets in his 11 years with the Sovereign Imperium's Reclamation Corps and the human boneyard hanging in high orbit above the frozen moon of Callus Reach looked, from his shuttle's viewport, exactly like every other one, rows of dark, silent hulls, drifting in loose formation, stripped of the urgency that had once defined them. "Sensor sweep confirms it, sir," said his junior technician, a nervous young man named Fessa Orn who had transferred into the Reclamation Corps 6 months earlier and had not yet learned to stop, sounding surprised every time a scan came back clean. 41 vessels. Power signatures negligible across the board. Hull composition matches decommissioned human naval designs, estimated 30 to 50 years out of active service. "This is a scrapyard, sir." "A big one?" Kovalis allowed himself a small, satisfied smile. Scrapyards were good news. Scrapyards meant tonnage, and tonnage meant his unit hit its quota for the quarter without anyone getting shot at, which was more than he could say for half the reclamation postings he'd drawn over the years. "Command wants confirmation before we start hauling," he said. "Get me eyes on the largest hull. Let's see what we're working with." The largest hull, according to Fessa's readout, was a vessel some 600 meters stem to stern, blocky and unglamorous in the way old human warship designs tended to be, its hull plating scarred with the particular dull pitting of decades spent drifting unmaintained in vacuum. Kovalis had read enough intelligence summaries over the years to recognize the general silhouette. An older generation human cruiser, a design phased out of frontline service, according to Imperial records, nearly 4 decades earlier. He had grown, over 11 years in the Reclamation Corps, into something of an informal expert on obsolete human hardware, a specialty few of his colleagues bothered to cultivate given how comparatively unglamorous the work was. Most reclamation officers angled for postings among the wealthier, more technologically advanced client species, where the scrap yielded exotic alloys and valuable prototype components. Human boneyards, by contrast, tended to be straightforward, unremarkable affairs, solid, practical engineering, nothing exotic, nothing that fetched a premium beyond the raw material value of the hulls themselves. That reputation, more than anything else, was what made Kovalis's growing unease over the following days so difficult for him to articulate, even to himself. He had catalogued dozens of human boneyards over the course of his career, and none of them had ever behaved like anything other than exactly what they appeared to be: quiet, dead, entirely inert. "Command's authorization came through," Fessa reported. "We're clear to begin extraction." "They want the reactor cores prioritized. Apparently there's a materials shortage back at the 3rd Fleet's refit yards, and human fusion housings scrap out at a premium." "Then let's not keep them waiting," Kovalis said, and gave the order to begin. It took Kovalis's reclamation team the better part of 2 days to strip the first 6 hulls of their reactor cores, their weapons mounts, and anything else his manifest flagged as valuable, a slow, methodical process involving cutting crews, magnetic tugs, and the particular tedious patience that scrap work demanded regardless of which species engineering you were dismantling. It was on the 3rd day, midway through extraction on the 7th hull, that Fessa Orn came to him with an expression Kovalis did not like at all. "Sir," Fessa said, "I think you should look at this." He led Kovalis to a secondary console, where a soft, intermittent pulse blinked against an otherwise dead readout. "This hull's main power grid should be completely inert. Every other ship in the boneyard reads the same: cold, dark, no active systems whatsoever. This one has a heartbeat. A small one. Something in the internal systems is drawing trickle power from somewhere, and I can't find the source. Kovalis frowned, studying the readout himself. Could be residual charge. Old capacitor banks bleeding off over the decades. Could be, Fessa said, though his tone made clear he didn't believe it. I ran the numbers twice, sir. Residual charge decays. This isn't decaying. It's steady. Like something's maintaining it. Kovalis felt the first small, cold thread of unease work its way into his chest, the particular, professional instinct of a man who had spent 11 years learning to trust readings that didn't fit the pattern, because readings that didn't fit the pattern were usually the ones that got salvage crews killed. Pull the extraction team off that hole, he said. Now. And get me a full sensor sweep of the entire boneyard. Every ship. I want to know if this is the only one behaving strangely, or if we've been missing something across the board. The sweep took 4 hours. When it finished, Fessa returned to him with a face considerably paler than it had been that morning. 11 holes, Fessa said. 11 of the 41 show the same trickle signature. Different systems in each case, some in the reactor housing, some in what looks like internal crew systems, one in what might be a weapons targeting array. All of them steady. All of them consistent with something being deliberately maintained, sir, not decaying. Kovalis stared at the display for a long moment, turning over 11 years of reclamation work, 11 years of scrapping obsolete hardware from a dozen different species, and finding, in all that experience, nothing that quite matched what he was looking at now. Recall the extraction teams, he finally said. All of them. Back to the shuttles, immediately. I want this reported to Fleet Command before we touch another hull. Fessa hesitated a moment before relaying the order, glancing back at the readout with an expression Kovalis recognized as the particular, uneasy fascination of a young technician who had just stumbled onto something considerably bigger than his training had prepared him to properly process. Sir, if I may ask, what do you think it is? The trickle signature. If it's not residual charge. Kovalis considered the question for a long moment before answering, weighing 11 years of professional caution against the young man's evident need for some kind of reassurance. I don't know, Fessa, he admitted. And I've learned, over the years, that not knowing is exactly the moment to stop touching things and start asking questions instead. Get the order out. The report reached Fleet Admiral Yeva Korsk aboard the light cruiser Providence's Edge, stationed at the edge of the Callus Reach system as escort for the reclamation operation, roughly 6 hours after Kovalis transmitted it, a delay that would later prove, in the after-action assessments compiled by considerably more senior officers than Korsk, to have made no meaningful difference to what followed. Korsk read the report twice, her expression tightening with each pass. She had commanded escort details for reclamation operations for the better part of a decade, and she had never once received a report describing anything resembling what Kovalis was now describing, a supposedly dead boneyard exhibiting the kind of distributed, deliberately maintained power signatures that no genuinely decommissioned fleet should exhibit at all. Get me a channel to the salvage team, she ordered. And pull every scrap of intelligence we have on human decommissioning protocols. I want to know if there's a standard procedure that explains this before I start assuming the worst. The intelligence, when it arrived, was not reassuring. Imperial records on human naval decommissioning were sparse, compiled largely from intercepted trade communications and second-hand diplomatic sources rather than any direct, verified inspection, a gap in Imperial knowledge that Korsk found herself, reading through the thin file, increasingly uneasy about. "There's nothing definitive," her intelligence officer reported. "But there is one flagged item buried in a decade-old trade attaché's report. A passing reference to something the humans call a mothball reserve. Vessels retired from active frontline service but deliberately maintained in a low-power, rapid reactivation state, rather than fully decommissioned." The attaché's report didn't elaborate further. It wasn't considered strategically significant at the time. Kursk felt the same cold thread Kovalis had described tightening in her own chest. "Define rapid reactivation." "The report doesn't specify a time frame, Admiral." Kursk was already moving toward the command deck before her intelligence officer finished the sentence, a decision that would later be credited, in the formal inquiry that followed, with saving considerably more lives than it cost. "Recall the reclamation shuttles," she ordered. "All personnel back aboard the Providence's Edge immediately. And get me a full tactical scan of that boneyard. If those hulls are capable of reactivation, I want to know how close they already are to it." The scan came back 17 minutes later, and it told her everything she needed to know, and nothing she wanted to hear. "Admiral," her tactical officer reported, "power signatures across all 11 flagged hulls have increased by a factor of 6 in the last 10 minutes. Whatever dormant state they were in, they're no longer in it." What Fleet Admiral Kursk could not have known, watching her tactical display fill with rapidly strengthening power signatures, was that the reactivation sequence unfolding across the Callus Reach boneyard had been triggered nearly 9 hours earlier, the moment Kovalis's reclamation crews first began cutting into the 7th hull's outer plating, a breach detected not by any sophisticated Imperial sensor suite, but by a decades-old, deliberately simple intrusion alert system built specifically to survive the kind of long, silent dormancy the boneyard's ships had spent the better part of 4 decades enduring. The alert had reached a modest, unremarkable communications relay station on a nearby colony world, and from there, through a chain of automated protocols that had not required human intervention until the final step, to a retired naval officer named Marcus Webb, 73 years old, who had served aboard the very cruiser Kovalis's crew had first begun extracting reactor components from, some 40 years earlier, when it had still carried a different name and a crew of 400. Webb had not expected the call. Nobody who received it ever really did, whatever their training had told them to anticipate. He had spent the intervening decades running a modest fishing operation on a coastal colony 3 systems away, and the sudden, jarring arrival of a formal reactivation notice, the same notice every veteran of the old reserve fleet had signed on to receive, decades earlier, as a condition of their honorable discharge, had struck him with a complicated mixture of dread and something he was almost embarrassed to recognize in himself as relief. Figured this day might come eventually, he told his wife, packing a bag with the same deliberate, practiced efficiency he hadn't exercised in decades but found, somewhat to his own surprise, had never fully left him. "Didn't figure it'd come quite this late in my life." He was not alone. Across a dozen colony worlds, in fishing villages and mountain towns and quiet retirement communities, similar calls reached similar veterans, women and men who had once crewed the very ships now drifting in the Callus Reach boneyard, who had trained on those exact systems before newer designs replaced them, and who had, upon their discharge, quietly agreed to a standing obligation that most of them had long since stopped expecting to matter. The mothball reserve, as Imperial intelligence had only barely glimpsed, was not simply a matter of maintained hardware. It was a matter of maintained people, veterans who received, every few years, A brief refresher assignment aboard their old vessel classes, keeping their skills current against exactly the kind of unlikely, distant future emergency that had, without any warning at all, just arrived. Webb reached the reserve staging point 11 hours after the initial alert, one of nearly 2,000 veterans converging from a dozen systems, and found, waiting for him in the modest briefing hall, a face he hadn't seen in decades, his old weapons officer, a wiry, silver-haired woman named Priya Chandrasekhar, who greeted him with the particular dry humor of someone who had clearly been expecting to see him again someday, even if neither of them had quite believed it. "Took you long enough," she said. "Had to feed the fish first," Webb said. "You know how they get." The journey took the better part of a day, and Webb spent much of it in the transport's cramped common area, surrounded by faces he half-recognized and others he'd never met at all, veterans of other reserve crews, other old hull classes, all summoned by the same cascading alert. He found himself, somewhere in the second hour of the journey, sitting across from a considerably younger woman, barely into her 30s, who introduced herself as Lieutenant Sarah Okonkwo, one of the reserve program's newest recruits, assigned 6 years earlier fresh out of active service specifically to help train the next generation of veterans who would, eventually, need to step into roles like Webb's own. "First activation?" Webb asked her. "First real one," Okonkwo admitted. "We run drills every 18 months, but I never actually expected the call to come. Everyone always talked about the reserve program like it was mostly ceremonial. Something we maintained out of tradition more than genuine necessity." Webb considered that for a moment, thinking of his own early years in the program, decades earlier, when he too had privately assumed the entire structure amounted to little more than an elaborate, expensive formality. "I thought the same thing, back when I first signed on," he said. "Took me a long while to understand the point of it wasn't really about expecting the call to come. It was about making sure that if it ever did, whoever answered it would actually know what they were doing, rather than scrambling to relearn everything from scratch under pressure. I suppose we're about to find out whether all those drills actually took." "You nervous?" Okonkwo asked. "A little," Webb admitted. "Mostly I'm just glad Chandrasekhar's coming along." Woman could talk a targeting array into behaving through sheer force of personality alone. If anyone's going to get this old girl running smooth again, it's her. They boarded the transport together, along with several hundred other veterans, and set course for Callus Reach. By the time the first fully crewed human vessel emerged from transit at the edge of the Callus Reach system, some 31 hours after the reclamation crew's initial breach, Fleet Admiral Kursk had withdrawn her escort force to a cautious standoff distance, uncertain whether the reactivating boneyard represented an automated defense response or something considerably more organized, and unwilling to risk her own vessel's closing distance until she understood which. She got her answer within the hour. The vessel that arrived was not, by any measure Kursk's tactical staff could apply, cutting edge. Its weapons systems, cross-referenced against Imperial threat assessments, matched designs that had been considered obsolete by galactic standards for the better part of 2 decades. Its shielding technology, while functional, lagged considerably behind anything currently deployed by Kursk's own modern escort cruisers. What it was not, however, was undermanned, uncoordinated, or hesitant. It moved with the particular, practiced confidence of a crew that had trained together for years, its approach vector calculated with a precision that Kursk's own tactical officer described, with evident and growing unease, as textbook, the kind of textbook precision you only get from officers who've run this exact maneuver 100 times before. not from a crew scrambled together in an emergency. Identify yourselves, Kursk transmitted, once the vessel closed to communication range, choosing caution over confrontation. Having learned enough in the preceding day to understand that whatever she was facing was not something to be dismissed lightly. Her tactical officer, watching the approaching vessel's formation with obvious professional discomfort, leaned toward her briefly before the channel connected. "Admiral, for what it's worth, I've reviewed the approach pattern 3 times now. That is not an improvised formation. Whoever's commanding that ship has run this exact maneuver enough times to make it look effortless. I would not recommend testing them, whatever else we decide to do here." "Noted," Kursk said, and opened the channel. The response came from a voice that carried the particular unhurried steadiness of someone who had, by every indication, done this exact kind of thing before. "This is Captain Marcus Webb, commanding the reserve cruiser Steadfast Return, formerly registered under decommissioned designation Hull 7, Callus Reach Mothball Fleet. I'll ask you plainly, Admiral, since I understand plain speaking tends to go over well with your people. Your reclamation cruise cut into my old ship without authorization, triggered a reactivation protocol that pulled several hundred veterans away from their families with less than a day's notice, and now I've got a boneyard full of my old shipmates coming back online behind me, most of them considerably less patient about this whole situation than I am. I'd like an explanation, and I'd like it before the rest of my old crewmates finish waking up and start asking considerably less polite questions themselves." Kursk found herself, hearing that, momentarily uncertain how to respond. The particular disorientation of a commander who had prepared for hostility and instead received something closer to weary, exasperated inconvenience. "Captain Webb," she said carefully, "our reclamation operation was authorized under standard salvage protocols, based on intelligence identifying this boneyard as fully decommissioned, non-functional hardware. We had no indication these vessels retained any operational capacity, let alone a standing reserve crew structure." "Well," Webb said, "now you know. I'd suggest telling your command chain to update their intelligence files, Admiral, before they cut into someone else's retirement plan a second time." By the time the full reserve fleet had reactivated, 31 vessels crewed within 72 hours, drawn from a veteran population that had, until that week, considered itself thoroughly retired. Kursk's report had already reached Imperial High Command, triggering a response considerably more anxious than the modest scrapyard misunderstanding that had started it. Grand Marshal Dressa Vorn, reviewing the incident report some days later, found herself, not for the first time in her career, marveling at the particular, layered depth of human institutional patience, a species that had, apparently, spent decades quietly maintaining not merely old hardware, but old expertise, against exactly the kind of unlikely contingency that had just, however accidentally, been tested. "I want to understand something clearly," she said, addressing Kursk directly during the formal debrief. These vessels were decades obsolete by galactic standards. Their crews were, by their own admission, retired for years, called back with less than a day's warning. And yet your own tactical assessment describes their response as disciplined, coordinated, and immediately effective. "That is an accurate summary, Grand Marshal," Kursk said. "I would add one further observation, if I may." Captain Webb indicated, in a later exchange, that this reserve system extends considerably beyond the single boneyard we encountered. He described it as one of several such reserves maintained across human territory, each staffed by veterans trained on the specific hardware they'd be recalled to crew, refreshed periodically to keep their skills current. I do not believe we encountered anything resembling the full scope of this system, Grand Marshal. I believe we encountered a single, relatively modest example of it. Vorn absorbed this in silence for a long moment, turning over the particular, uncomfortable implications. You are telling me, she finally said, that what we assumed was scrap metal was, in fact, a deliberately maintained strategic reserve, and that we have no reliable estimate of how many similar reserves exist, or how quickly they could be mobilized in a genuine crisis. That is my assessment, Grand Marshal, yes. Vorn was quiet for a while longer, and when she spoke again, her voice carried the particular, weary resignation of an officer recognizing a pattern she had encountered before in her own long career, and had hoped never to encounter again involving this particular species. I begin to suspect, she said, that every fixed assumption this empire holds about human military capability will, eventually, prove considerably less fixed than we would prefer. She turned to a secondary matter, one that had been raised repeatedly during the preceding day's flurry of diplomatic exchanges. There is the question of formal apology and compensation for the disruption caused to these veterans and their families. The human government has been notably restrained in its demands, all things considered, but I do not believe restraint should be mistaken for indifference. What would you recommend, Admiral, having dealt with Captain Webb directly? Kursk considered the question carefully. I would recommend, Grand Marshal, that we take his request at face value rather than searching for some hidden diplomatic leverage behind it. He asked for an accurate accounting of what happened, appropriate compensation for the veterans whose lives were disrupted, and a formal commitment that future reclamation operations verify target status considerably more thoroughly before proceeding. He did not ask for anything beyond that. I would suggest granting it promptly and without argument, Grand Marshal. I do not believe this is a negotiation we are well positioned to haggle over, given the circumstances that created it. Vorn nodded slowly. A reasonable recommendation, Admiral. I will see it implemented. She paused, studying Kursk with an expression that carried something close to genuine curiosity. I confess I am curious about one further matter, Admiral, if you're willing to indulge an old officer's professional interest. You spent considerable time in direct communication with Captain Webb over those first uncertain hours. What was your impression of him, beyond the tactical assessment already reflected in your formal report? Kursk considered the question for a moment before answering. He struck me, Grand Marshal, as a man doing an unusual, unexpected job with the same steady competence he'd clearly brought to it decades earlier, without any particular relish for the disruption it caused him personally. I do not believe he wanted this confrontation any more than we did. I believe he simply understood, better than we initially credited him for, exactly what his role required of him when the moment arrived, and met it without complaint. A useful quality in an officer, Vorn observed, regardless of which government they happened to serve. I found myself thinking precisely the same thing, Grand Marshal, Kursk said. 6 months later, Fleet Admiral Kursk received an unexpected personal transmission. Not through any official diplomatic channel, but a direct, informal message from Captain Marcus Webb, who had, in the intervening months, returned to his fishing operation once the formal diplomatic resolution to the Callus Reach incident had been finalized. Admiral, wanted to let you know there's no hard feelings on my end, for what it's worth. Wasn't your crew's fault they didn't know what they were looking at, that's on whoever's compiling your intelligence files, and I'd suggest a stern word in their direction if you get the chance. Caught a good run of silverfin this week, first proper vacation I've had in longer than I care to admit. Hope your own people are keeping you similarly well. Kursk read the message twice, and found herself smiling, despite the considerable institutional embarrassment the entire affair had cost her government. She drafted a brief reply before returning to the considerably less pleasant business of the day's remaining reports. Captain Webb. Glad to hear the fishing's good. I've passed along the suggestion regarding our intelligence gathering, with considerably more force than diplomatic protocol typically allows. I suspect it will be some time before this empire looks at anything labeled a decommissioned quite the same way again. She set the message aside and turned back to her reports, carrying with her a lesson she suspected would outlast her own career, that a species capable of maintaining, for decades, both the hardware and the people to answer a call nobody expected to come, was not a species whose true capabilities could ever be safely assumed from a single glance at what appeared, on the surface, to have already been set aside. Some months later, long after the formal diplomatic resolution had been finalized and the Callus Reach incident had settled into the particular institutional memory reserved for cautionary tales, Kursk found herself reviewing a considerably broader intelligence briefing, one commissioned in direct response to the incident, examining every human boneyard and reclamation site currently on Imperial survey manifests across the wider region. The findings, compiled over several careful months by analysts determined not to repeat Kovalis's original mistake, were sobering in their scope. Of the 43 separate human decommissioning sites the Empire had previously catalogued as fully inert scrap, preliminary sensor surveys, conducted this time, with considerably more caution and considerably more patience than the original Callus Reach operation, suggested that at least 19 exhibited signature patterns consistent with maintained reserve status, rather than genuine decommissioning. Kursk read that figure several times, turning over its implications with the same careful attention she'd once applied to Kovalis's original, uneasy report. 19 sites. Not one accidental discovery, but a deliberate, systemic pattern, a species that had, apparently, spent decades quietly hedging against exactly the kind of miscalculation the Empire had just made, on a scale considerably larger than anyone within Imperial command had previously imagined. She requested, and was granted, a final informal exchange with Captain Webb before the file was formally closed, curious whether he might offer some further insight into the scope of what the Empire had only barely glimpsed. Captain Webb. I find myself with one further question, if you're willing to indulge it. Our survey teams have identified a considerable number of additional sites across your territory that may share characteristics similar to the one we encountered at Callus Reach. I do not ask for any operational details, and I understand entirely if this falls outside what you're able or willing to discuss. I ask only out of the same professional curiosity that seems to have characterized our entire acquaintance. How many more surprises should this Empire expect to find, the next time it looks too casually at something it assumes has already been set aside? His reply arrived several days later, characteristically brief, and carrying, even in its brevity, a note of something that read, to Kursk, almost like gentle amusement. Admiral, I couldn't tell you the full count even if I wanted to, above my pay grade, and has been for a good while now. What I can tell you is this: we're a species that doesn't much like throwing things away, whether that's old ships, old skills, or old promises we made to look out for each other. I'd plan around the assumption that whatever you've found so far isn't the whole picture, and I suspect you'll save yourself considerable trouble down the line for having assumed it. Take care of yourself, Admiral. And maybe pass along a word to whoever's writing your survey manifests going forward. Might save everyone a good deal of unnecessary excitement. Kursk read the message once more, then closed the file and found herself. Despite the considerable institutional unease the whole affair continued to represent, smiling faintly at the particular, understated honesty of it, a fitting final note, she thought, to an incident that had begun with a routine scrap order and ended with an entire empire quietly, permanently revising what it thought it knew about a species it had assumed, for far too long, it fully understood. The END.